So I'm going to start with space and looking at the space trends. And the first trend that I want to focus on is the question of space versus enrollment growth. And so this looks at enrollment growth on the line from 2007 to 2014 and space growth. So how much new enrollment and new space and how much of that has grown over this 7-year period. And you can see that early on in this period of time, enrollment was growing very rapidly, and we hit 8% over a 4-year period, about 2% a year. And space was, we were actually building less space than enrollment growth. People started to realize that more students were coming, and we needed to start building up that space. And for many campuses, it takes a long time for space to get built, 2 or 3 years. And so we're beginning to see that some of the space built in 2012 and 13 and 14 actually was responding to a trend that had occurred 2 or 3 years earlier. But what's happening in many parts of the country, particularly the Northeast and the Midwest of the United States, less in places like Texas and Utah and some other places across the country. But what is happening nationally when we look at the national data is the enrollment numbers have leveled off and, in fact, are beginning to go down in terms of percentage growth. There's still more students in 2014 than there were in 2007 by about 7%, but that continued growth in enrollment has not sustained. However, we're continuing to build square footage. We'll get into this in a few more minutes, but one of the clear implications here is that tuition revenue is not growing, but the debt that has occurred as a result of enrollment growth and space growth is on the books and has to be paid for. We looked at this by constituent group, and one caveat here is that we have a fairly small number of community colleges on this data set, and so, you know, this may not be reflective of everything that we've seen here of community colleges across the country. But the only types of institutions where the line on enrollment growth is not kind of crossing the space growth are research institutions. Research institutions actually continue to grow in enrollment and have been pretty modest in their growth in space. You can see comprehensive and doctoral institutions have grown over 14% space. They've gotten a big increase in students, but that's very much leveled off last 3 years. Community colleges, after a huge spike and now responding to that spike by building more space, have actually begun to see a drop-off from that spike, although they are, as we see here, 17% above where they were in 2007. The most troubling are smaller institutions. These are institutions that have less than 3,000 students, and our students, and as you can see, they're basically back at 2007 levels in terms of enrollment, but they've built quite a bit more space. We're going to take a look at the kind of space that was built in a few minutes. When we take a look at total space per student, and what we've seen is not a dramatic, but pretty steady growth here, both of the public and the private and the national average in terms of the amount of space per student growing. So you can see that back in 2007, on the public side, it was just below 300. On the private side, it was about 575. So quite a few more students going on public campuses than private campuses on a square foot basis. But the national average has grown, as you can see, from around 400 to about 450. So we are adding more space faster than we are adding the students, and as a result, you're seeing there is more space per student. What kind of space is there? And that is what this, we went back, we looked at the building that was built on our database going back to 1880, and we classified it as whether it was academic space or non-academic space. And what we're seeing is essentially a 100-year trend. 1915 was the biggest gap between academic and non-academic space, where people were building about 70% of the space was academic, about 30% of the space was non-academic. Over the last 100 years, we have steadily built less academic space and more non-academic space. And we're getting close to the point where it's about 50-50 on college campuses in terms of new construction. Now, some of this makes sense because some of the non-academic space, particularly residential space, can get paid for by cost of housing and board, and so it's revenue producing. Athletic space can be revenue producing. Even dining space can be revenue producing, and so I think we're seeing that. Also, from a non-academic standpoint, with the growth of online learning over the last few years, you may need fewer classrooms because students are not coming to class physically coming to class. They're taking more and more courses online. Yet it is concerning, and particularly when we looked at those small institutions, we found that the growth on small institutions was very much in the non-academic area. New dorms, recreation centers, new dining opportunities, things that they thought could attract students. But as I go back and show you that chart a couple of slides ago, you could see that the small institutions, basically, that hasn't worked as an aggregate. For individual institutions, certainly there are individual institutions that have built new space and it's helped them attract new students or keep the enrollment they have. But for most small institutions, this has not paid off as much as I think they thought it was going to pay off, and they've got the additional debt of taking on the new space. Now, what's the type of space and when it was built is really critical as we look at issues around capital investment and backlog. And those of you who've been following our state of facilities, this chart's been in the state of facilities every year for the last 3 years. It looks at what percentage of the total constructed space in our database, the 1.5 billion, was built in a certain year. And you can see that the post-war era continues to be the peak era, 1955 to 1975, that 20-year period, of which 35% of all the square footage on our campuses was built during that point in time. Now, this actually has come down as a percentage of total because that total complex era from 1995, essentially to current, is at 31% now. That's growing. We're continuing to grow space in this complex era. What's important is the chart across the top. Obviously, pre-war space, built before 1951, iconic buildings, durable construction, built to last. They need programmatic updates, but they're still the bones are solid and they're in good shape. The post-war space was of lower quality construction. Baby boomers were coming to school. Federal government was adding money for research. The campuses were growing. The land grant campuses grew dramatically during this time. And so, as a result, things were built fast, lower quality construction. You know these buildings, flat roof, casement windows, brick buildings that many of you are struggling with and have very high levels of deferred maintenance. Those buildings, all built between 1955 and 1975, have either hit 50 years if they haven't been, the clock on those buildings for the building systems hasn't been reset, or will hit 50 years in the next 10 years. And so this peak is not over. We're seeing the deferred maintenance that's coming forward in these buildings. The life cycles have not been reset in the buildings, and that big spike is part of what our, in Sightlines terms, we call this the asset reinvestment need or the catch-up need. That's critical. And many of these buildings, people are finding maybe they shouldn't even continue to have these buildings. They ought to demolish them and replace them with something else. The complex era buildings are a little bit different in that they are more technically complex. They are buildings that maybe are more expensive to maintain and keep at high quality because of the complexity of the systems, but we find them they're higher quality. They are more like the pre-war buildings from the standpoint of built to last. It's just that they're very complex and require maybe a different set of people to be able to deal with those. So that age profile, that when things were built are important, and we'll come back to this in a couple minutes. We also looked at that construction age, so how that those time frames, under what percentage of space is under 10, what percentage of space 10 to 25, what percentage of space is in the 25 to 50, and in the over 50 eras. And then we looked at renovation age. And this renovation age, for those who already are members of Sightlines, you know that it means more than 50% of the replacement value was invested in this building, and the mechanical systems, clock of mechanical systems was reset, and new life cycles were put in place so the building acts like a new building. The renovation age, as you can see, very interesting. About 20% is under 10, 25%, 10 to 25, 31% 25 to 50, and 24% over 50. And of course, as you go up to from under 10 to over 50, the risk factors go up. and that is that major life cycles of building components are past due and the risk of failure comes up. But what we are seeing here is where you've targeted your capital dollars for resetting the clock, gut renovations of buildings, and it's been on the over 50 space. In construction age, 37% of the square footage should be over 50 years old right now, but renovation age, it's 24%. So you've made these buildings newer. They are more complex now. You've added new systems, and you've brought them up and to basically address sort of the millennial expansion. And some of the under 10 buildings are part of that new space that's been constructed. So we've seen a combination of new space and renovation through replacement that's reset the clock on buildings. What's interesting is that 25 to 50-year-old space, which in many cases is some of that poorly constructed, poor quality spaces, hasn't changed. It's still there, about 30%. And it tells me also that some of you are sitting and waiting to see what you're going to do with some of those 60s and 70s buildings that you haven't made the decision on whether you're going to reset the clock and renovate them or maybe get rid of those buildings. And so there's some waiting on the sidelines here for some of those buildings. This is how it looks like public versus private. You can see that there's been a little bit more progress on resetting the clock on private campuses, public campuses, than on private campuses. 42% of that 25 to 50 was in 2007. That's down to 34%. So you can see that public universities, which tend to have more of this space anyway, on that era space, are actually attacking that space a little more aggressively than the private. You can see the private campuses have quite a bit of space over 50 and have always had a lot of space over 50. Not necessarily a bad thing from the standpoint that many of these are those iconic buildings, some of which have been renovated completely and some have not. So let's take a look now at capital and how investing in capital has affected the square footage of these buildings.
Hey, Jim, we have a quick question
on
space. If you go back to the space per student slide.
Yes, be glad to.
The question is, how does space per student compare to 30 to 40 years ago?
I think we'd have to calculate that. It's an excellent question. I think certainly this is a growth trend. I don't think there's any question that we're seeing additional square footage be added, net new square footage over the last 20 to 30 years. And so I would think that our peaks probably were somewhere in terms of enrollment between the 2007 and 2011 period, as we showed the enrollment numbers kind of dropping off 12, 13, and 14. So the fact that they continue to go up even though enrollment growth is not as robust as it was earlier suggests to me that these numbers are probably higher than they were 20, 30 years ago. Great question. We can go back and calculate it, though, because we shouldn't be able to get that data. We have both student data and space data.